Welcome to CSBA's Research Update. I'm Mary Briggs, Senior Director of Research and Education Policy Development for CSBA.
And I'm Jeremy Anderson, an Education Policy Analyst with our research team at CSBA.
Today we're going to be talking to you about the use of federal COVID relief dollars and the research that our department has been working on for CSBA over the last 2 years. So as we think about the federal relief dollars, specifically today we're going to talk about Esser and GEAR. Education is notorious for acronyms, so maybe we should start with some of the basics. What are Esser and GEAR?
Yeah, that's a good question. So over the course of 2020 and 2021, the federal government passed a series of substantially larger aid packages to help school districts and county offices of education address the wide range of needs brought on by the pandemic. So Esser stands for the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief, and GEAR is the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund. That fund was intended to give governors more flexibility on how to spend those dollars for students most impacted by the pandemic.
So now that we know a little bit about what Esser and GEAR are, could you talk a little bit about how much funding was allocated to California's local educational agencies?
Yeah, so over time, as I mentioned, that amount got much larger in subsequent packages. So in the first package, Esser 1, California LEAs were allocated about $1.4 billion. In Esser 2, that increased to about $5.7 billion. And when we get to Esser 3, we're looking at almost 12 times the amount of Esser 1 at $12.8 billion.
What are the deadlines for spending those funds?
Yeah, so every one of the funds has two deadlines associated with them. The first is a deadline to reserve the funding by the local agency that needs to have their plans put forth. And the second deadline is the expiration of the funds, or when they need to be spent down by. So for Esser 1, we just passed a really significant milestone. January 30th, 2023 is when Esser 1 expired. They go yearly after that. So Esser 2, January 2024, and Esser 3, January 2025. Something really important about Esser 3 is it's actually broken up in reporting into two different funds. And the reason for this is there is a general Esser 3 fund, but there's also a 20% set aside that has to be spent on the academic impact of lost instructional time.
To be clear, although there is an academic impact set aside, districts can be addressing things like learning recovery through other portions of their relief funding, correct?
Correct, and it's important to know that 20% is a minimum. So if a district chose, they could go above that minimum in those specific categories. Also important to point out that expenses relating to learning recovery are woven throughout almost all of the different packages that have been passed. And there are very specific packages directed at learning recovery that school districts draw from. So there are a lot of different efforts and a lot of funding out there for learning recovery. And our data shows that school districts are doing that work with that funding.
Jeremy, could you share what CSBA has been doing to monitor the use of those funds?
Yeah, sure. So we have been monitoring the use of these funding packages since pretty much the beginning of their inception. Early on, there were a lot of concerns out there about the pace of spending and whether school districts would be able to get through all of the money and how it was being spent. So what we did as our research team was pull the quarterly reports and analyze that data. So we put out our first report on that financial data in June of 2022. But we also wanted to go underneath that data, understanding that numbers don't tell the full picture at the local level for schools. So to do that, we launched a statewide survey capturing 239 school districts and county offices of education from across the state that was largely representative of the state. And we were able to pull out the priorities, the challenges, the experiences of our members at the local level. That report can be found at our central resource page on our website. So over time since that report, we have put out quarterly blogs, fact sheets, capturing the updated data pretty much every quarter. Most recently, we analyzed the spring data, which captured the last quarter of Esser 1 spending, and we put that out as a fact sheet, which is also on the website.
So you mentioned analyzing the quarterly reports, and that is one of the features of Esser and GEAR, is that every quarter the LEAs are required to submit reports on how they have spent their relief funding in the past period. I'm wondering if you could share what our research team has learned looking at the most recent 2023 expenditure reports.
Sure. So Focusing first just on the financial data, a really important caveat of these spending reports is they capture money that has been spent already. They don't capture money that is being planned to spend or is tied up in a program for future spending. So that's the data that we're looking at. Looking just at the financial data and focusing first on Esser 1 and Gear 1, happy to say that LEAs reported spending 99.9% of their allocations by the January 30th, 2023 deadline. Another way you could look at it is that 99.8% of school districts and county offices of education that received Esser 1 funding spent all of it, or 100%. Looking at Esser 2 and 3, Esser 2, school districts and county offices spent 83% of their allocations, and looking forward to Esser 3, which has the latest deadline. And so we've heard from administrators that they're going first money first and then focusing on later packages later. That one's at about 7% of Esser 3 allocations.
Wonderful. So within those reports that county offices and districts submit, we know that they are required to report under different categories. So what are the things that we have learned about some of the areas in which they are using those dollars?
Yeah. So important to know, every funding package has a collection of legislatively defined categories. Some of these categories are very specific, so like expenses to reduce virus mitigation. Other categories are a bit broader, which makes it a little more difficult to see at the line item what's going on unless you look locally. What we can say about some of the analysis that we've done is that there have been big upticks on tutoring and mental health expenses over the past 2 quarters, and that educational technology expenses have persisted basically throughout the entire pandemic. And so, like I said, there are some limits to what we can know with this data. The funding is coded rather broadly sometimes, and there are also important things to note when we're thinking about the pace of spending over time. So I had mentioned the different percentages that had been spent. There are some mitigating factors that have really impacted our LEAs over time in this spending. One of which is supply chain issues, which last year was a really prevalent issue. Another is staffing issues. Some of these positions that LEAs are targeting to get support during the pandemic, such as mental health professionals, are at a shortage, and it's very difficult to get them for different districts. And I would say the other one that's really top of mind for administrators and board members is that this is one-time funding with deadlines, which means in the future, this funding will end, and administrators and board members are going to have to make really difficult decisions about programs that have benefited students across the educational spectrum.
What are some things that board members should think about doing with the remainder of the time for these funding programs?
Yeah, there are 3 main things I think that board members should be thinking about when they're thinking about these funds. Number 1 is they should always be aware of the next deadline for the next package and when these different funding packages expire so they can plan accordingly. 2, they should be continuously monitoring the efficacy of these programs to make sure the programs are working the way they're intended and that they're helping those students who have been most historically disadvantaged or most impacted by the pandemic. And 3, I would say one of the biggest ones is, while monitoring for progress and monitoring for efficacy, is to bring the community in, to continually update the community and work with the community on the progress, which can only create opportunities for trust and transparency. Because at the end of the day, these broad data sets and these broad stories about how funding is happening are important, but it's really about what's happening at the local level and with local data that they should be paying attention to and help them make decisions.
What would you say to those who are concerned about the pace of the reported expenditures or the lack of specificity in the reports about the ways that districts are using those funds?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, for all of the reasons I discussed earlier, staffing shortages, supply chain issues, being mindful about the one-time nature of these funds, school leaders are being really thoughtful about the ways that these dollars are at play to help students who have been impacted. They don't want to get to the end of the deadlines for these funds and all of a sudden have a drop-off. So they're going through programs and being meticulous about what could be helpful for students right now. Another reason to note is that there are a lot of other funds out there that school districts are drawing from. When the pandemic was going on, states also passed a series of grant packages. So some examples of those would be the Extended Learning Opportunities Program, the Learning Loss Mitigation Fund, AB 86. All of these were put at play so that school districts could quickly address what was happening to their students at the local level. And again, I really want to point out that if you want to know how learning recovery efforts are happening, local data is going to be the most helpful in doing that. So digging down into individual districts might be the most helpful.
I think another point that we've been discussing is also the fact that there are a range of ways that folks might need to address first some of the issues that will help with learning recovery. For instance, chronic absence. For districts that are having an issue with re-engaging students, the funds being used to address chronic absenteeism are actually ones that will get kids back in classrooms so that they can work in different intervention programs and get the supports for learning acceleration.
Yeah, that's such an important point. And in addition to that would be funding for mental health services. Students are going through trauma, staff that are going through trauma are not going to be able to get to the learning recovery stage if those needs aren't addressed first. That's a good point.
That's really helpful. I think at this point, we've covered a lot of the kind of top line areas. If people want to learn more about the research that CSBA has been doing on this topic, where can they go?
Yeah, so we have a wide range of resources right now at our website, csba.org. We have a central COVID relief spending page that you can find. And also importantly, if anyone has any feedback or would like to talk to us more about this work, you can get in touch with us at research@csba.org, which will get you into contact with our team members.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, for sharing all that REPD and CSBA have been doing on behalf of our members.
Absolutely, it's been a pleasure, and we look forward to bringing our research to everybody in the future.